if I told you that the world was gonna end? I think you hit the deep end. It's just me with me or your friend. Would you take the
Welcome to Fantasy 15, a podcast meant to answer all of your fantasy football questions, or as many as I can get to in 15 minutes. I'm your host, Zach Freed, and as always, we've only got 15 minutes. We're officially on the clock. This week continues the Truth Hurts series, where I'm going to go through each position comparing the top fantasy finishes on the year to the truth behind how those players actually finished. For example, last week we talked about how Raheem Mostert finished as running back 27, but from week 12 on he was actually running back 7. Today we're looking at wide receivers, and we'll be using half point per reception scoring to split the difference between standard and PPR leagues. Let's get to it.
True hurts needed something more exciting.
Coming in at wide receiver 1 is Michael Thomas.
Michael!
Thomas set an NFL record of 149 receptions. He was first in yards with over 1,725 yards. He tied for third with 9 touchdowns. And he was predictable because only 2 times was he way over or way under his projections. The questions surrounding him, though, are more about Drew Brees than they really are about Michael Thomas. Is Drew Brees going to retire? As indications show that Drew Brees is either going to re-sign with the Saints or he's going to retire. He's not going to be going to another NFL team, so we'll have to watch that closely. But Bridgewater was the quarterback for the Saints for a bulk of the season, and so it wouldn't be a terrible thing if Bridgewater stuck around. Thomas would still probably have the same production. They're probably going to get some receiver help as well, which should open things up a little bit more. I don't necessarily think Michael Thomas will be able to repeat a record-setting receptions year, but he should be able to repeat as a top fantasy wide receiver. Plus, he just signed a big contract, so he's not really going anywhere. At number 2 is Chris Godwin, and he played 2 less games than a lot of receivers on this list. He was third in yards with 1,333 yards, second in yards per game, and he too was tied for third in touchdowns with 9. Only 2 players in top 25 receptions had more yards per catch, and one of them was Mike Evans, who's a player on his team. The big question surrounding Godwin is, who is the wide receiver 1 for Tampa Bay? Is it Mike Evans or is it Chris Godwin? And Godwin finished higher this year, and he has the bigger role in the Arians offense, so it would seem that he is the safer play. He may have a lower ceiling than Evans, but his role in the offense is a lot more stable. The big question, though, is what's going on with Jameis Winston. Is he going to come back? Is he going to make it past next year? And who's going to be throwing the ball to Chris Godwin? Because that's something that's very important when we look at fantasy value. Next up is Julio Jones, and he played 1 less game as well. He tied for 20th in touchdowns. He only had 6. Imagine what Julio Jones could be if he scored touchdowns like an average receiver of his standing within a team. He was 5th in receptions, 2nd in yards, 3rd in yards per game, and the Falcons threw the ball more than anyone else in the NFL this year. If their line improves, they'll be able to throw the ball downfield a little bit more. Ryan this season was forced to throw short because he had no time. The fact of the matter is time is running out in Atlanta. They should make a final push with Ryan and Julio for a Super Bowl before those players get too much older. Coming in at number 4 on this list is shockingly Cooper Kupp. He had a very hot start. He was actually wide receiver 3 all the way up until week 8, but from week 10 on, he was wide receiver 21. He had 10 touchdowns, which was second best in the NFL. And so expect there to be some regression, because in the second half of the season, he didn't do so well. Kupp, Woods, Cooks, Higbee, Gurley, there are so many weapons in the Rams offense, and Goff is the one who's deciding where the ball goes. So that's a scary prospect to me. Yes, Cooper Kupp is a great receiver, but is he truly an elite receiver? Is he a guaranteed top 5 finish? I don't think so. At wide receiver 5 is DeAndre Hopkins, and this is a little misleading because if you take out week 17 where he didn't play, he actually finishes as wide receiver 3. He had a very rough stretch early on, weeks 2 through 7. He was down in targets from the past 2 seasons, but he was still tied for second in receptions among all wide receivers. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey was second in the NFL. And he was down from double-digit touchdowns that he usually gets. He's gotten that the last 2 seasons as well. Expect a return to form in 2020. Nothing's really going to change for that offense. They're maybe going to get a different running back, but the scheme, the offense, the quarterback, the pieces more or less are going to be staying the same. And Houston's offense is going to continue to put up points, and Hopkins is going to continue to be a feature player in that offense. Wide receiver 6 this year was Kenny Golladay, and he did it primarily with Jeff Driscoll and David Blau as quarterback. Stafford was having a smash year before he went to injured reserve. He actually was on pace to finish as quarterback 3, so next season could be pretty incredible for Kenny Golladay. He led the NFL in touchdowns with 11, which is pretty low as far as the statistic goes. He was 28th in receptions, but he averaged over 18 yards per catch. He had huge plays when he caught the ball. Air yards is a stat that makes for big boom receivers, and Kenny Golladay was up there in air yards. He leveled up beyond his QB, and that's something you can't deny because he did this season with a backup and then a third-string quarterback. Kenny Golladay is a receiver that I expect to maybe make a jump up a tier from where he was this season. Next up is Devante Parker. And if I learned anything from Parker this season, it's that Adam Gase is a really bad coach. This is just another player from that Miami team that once Gase was gone had a huge breakout year. Week 2, he had no points for you. He did nothing. He left week 14 in the first quarter with a concussion, and still he was able to finish as wide receiver 7 on the season. From week 10 on, after Preston Williams left on IR, he was wide receiver 2. He definitely leveled up, but it's a question of whether or not it was him or whether or not it was some of that Fitz magic. Because with the likelihood of Tua being the draft pick and Fitzpatrick not staying beyond next season, we don't know if Devante Parker is truly going to be the same receiver that he was this year. He had the highest totals of his career in most stats by a lot. It wasn't close. So maybe this is an outlier year, or maybe it's simply him taking the step that the Dolphins drafted him to be. If the Dolphins do draft Tua, which is what they're expected to do, he could be even better. Who knows? He's an asset that is very interesting going forward. Wide receiver 8 was Keenan Allen, and his first and third weeks of the season were so high in fantasy points, so much so that he was wide receiver 25 from week 4 on. He had close to the same numbers from the previous 2 years, and this is kind of Keenan Allen's skis. He ends up as a high finishing wide receiver, but the path there isn't really what you want. We're going to talk about a couple other guys that do a similar process. He was second in the NFL in receptions. He gets points in bunches, and then he fades away, though. So it's not really something you can trust, especially because we have no idea who the Chargers quarterback is going to be next year. It's most likely not going to be Phillip Rivers. So are they going to go out and get somebody, or are they just going to have Tyrod Taylor, their backup this year, step into the starting role? If that happens, I would actually downgrade Keenan Allen going into next season because I don't think Tyrod's a quarterback that I really trust for a top fantasy receiver. At wide receiver 9 was Amari Cooper, and much like Keenan Allen, he's never really been consistent. Sometimes he's Amari Cooper. Now it seems like there is at least a pattern in his finishes. It seemed like a home road split where the home games he would have these big boom blow up games, and the road games he'd just kind of disappear, especially if they were facing a good defense. The biggest question surrounding Cooper currently is whether or not he's going to get re-signed in Dallas. It seems like he is, but what exactly is that McCarthy offense going to look like? I've never really been comfortable with Amari Cooper on my team. He's great for best ball, but he's not really somebody you can trust. At number 10 is Julian Edelman, and through week 14 he was actually wide receiver 5. He had a career high in yards, he was 4th in receptions, and so far this offseason he's 1st in number of cars jumped on. All in all, Edelman is not necessarily a player who, dynasty-wise, I want to invest a lot in. He's possibly losing Tom Brady, and he led the league in drops this season with 13. In redraft, he will be a huge value because of his age, especially if Brady comes back. But if Brady's gone, I don't know if Edelman really is relevant anymore in fantasy football. At 11 is Allen Robinson, and this is pretty incredible because his quarterback is Mitch Trubisky. he only caught 63% of his targets. He had 7 drops, but not all of the missed targets were his fault. That's a lot on the quarterback. This was his best year since he went 1,414 in year 2 at Jacksonville. He's the clear number 1 receiver in Chicago. The questions with Allen Robinson are 100% based on his quarterback. Do you trust Mitch Trubisky to get him the ball? Does Trubisky get better, or do the Bears struggle offensively for another year until they can move on at quarterback? Wide receiver 12 was Mike Evans.
Michael!
And this is pretty crazy because he missed 3 games. He was actually wide receiver 3 when he went on to injured reserve. He was on pace to finish as wide receiver 4 on the season, which means Tampa Bay would have had 2 top 4 receivers on the season. He had 3 games with over 30 fantasy points, but he had 6 games with under 10 fantasy points. Take out weeks 3 and 4 where he had huge boom games, and he would have been disappointing. Mike Evans is really inconsistent, but when you get the games you want from him, he wins you weeks. Godwin is in the feature role in the Arians offense, so I'm still going to take Evans, but if I do, I'm going to pair him with a receiver that I can trust, a receiver that's consistent. He's still probably a top 12 receiver with Jameis, especially if their pass defense doesn't get any better. At wide receiver 13 was Jarvis Landry, and he was wide receiver 3 from week 9 on. He had 138 targets. Odell Beckham Jr. had 133. Jarvis was the number 1 on the team. Some of those targets that went to OBJ were definitely forced. The thing that's hard to predict with Baker Mayfield is that he doesn't really just lock on to one receiver. He spreads the ball around quite a bit. So the talent really has the opportunity to rise to the top. The offense should get better. OBJ could be better if that injury was truly holding him back. But honestly, he's struggled to play a 16-game season, so he's not really somebody I'm worried about when it comes to Jarvis Landry's value going into next year. OBJ finished this year as wide receiver 26, and this was only the second time that he's played an entire 16-game season. The biggest thing to worry about is if Odell Beckham Jr. is the squeaky wheel next season, will he get the grease to keep him quiet? Wide receiver 14 was Tyler Lockett, and through week 10, he was actually wide receiver 5. That's when he suffered an injury that put him in the hospital. He didn't really miss any games because of it, because it happened during the bye week. The question, though, is will he have to compete next season with DK Metcalf? DK finished as wide receiver 32, and each had a big game in the playoffs, so it's going to be hard to predict. It's kind of like a Golladay Marvin Jones situation where you don't really know. There's not really a determining factor to predict which player is going to have the big boom game. Wide receiver 15 was A.J. Brown. When Tannehill took over, he was wide receiver 3, but he didn't do much in the playoffs. He has huge big play potential every time he touches the ball, though, and he's one of the only people that can stand next to DK Metcalf and not look like a total fat slob. A.J. Brown's interesting, though, because we don't know what the Tennessee offense is going to look like. I'm assuming they're going to re-sign Derrick Henry. I think they'd be foolish not to re-sign Ryan Tannehill, but they have 2 huge pieces this offseason that they need to shore up, and it's going to determine a lot of A.J. Brown's future and his ADP going into next season. At wide receiver 16 was DJ Chark. He was actually wide receiver 8 through week 14. That's when his injury happened, and he tried to struggle through it for a few games before sitting out. He had a breakout week 1, and he did this all despite shaky quarterback play. I expect Minshew to be the quarterback next season, but it's really hard to predict because they have a new offensive coordinator as well. The offense might not pass much, but Jay Gruden was an offensive coordinator for the Bengals, and A.J. Green seemed to put up great numbers when he was there. So Chark could have a similar path that A.J. Green did years ago. Wide receiver 22 was Michael Gallup.
Michael!
He jumped from 30 to 22 because of week 17. He had a huge game. He was second in drops with 11, but he missed 2 games. And if you look at the season averages in fantasy points, Amari Cooper had 12.9, Michael Gallup had 12.8. Michael Gallup is a huge value player in fantasy, and he's a little bit more consistent than Cooper. At wide receiver 24 was Davante Adams, and he missed 4 games, but after he came back from his injury, he was wide receiver 5 for the rest of the year. He was on pace to finish as wide receiver 4 in the games he played. They should get wide receiver help in Green Bay, and the offense is in the second year of the system, so it might improve even more. Aaron Jones probably won't be a superhero again next year and should regress in touchdowns, which means there will be a lot more touchdowns on the table for Adams. Our last receiver today was wide receiver 30, Tyreek Hill.
The fastest predator on land. The cheetah.
Hill missed 4 games, but once he came back, he was wide receiver 5. Next season, they'll most likely cut Sammy Watkins because of the amount of money he's owed, and they probably won't re-sign Demarcus Robinson, which means it will be Kelsey, Hill, and Hardman as far as the receivers go, and I think Mahomes will continue to be great. So I expect Hill to be a top receiver next season. That's all the time we have today. Thanks for joining me. Please subscribe, comment, rate, review, share, scream from the rooftops to spread the word about this podcast. And be sure to follow on Twitter at Fantasy15, that's Fantasy, ONEFIVE, on Facebook at facebook.com/Fantasy15, and email any questions to Fantasy15 at gmail.com. Thanks again. See you next week.